Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining me this evening. It's Wednesday, right? It's Wednesday evening. Thank you for joining me this evening, and thank you for tuning in for our next class in the book of Deuteronomy. We are in Deuteronomy chapter 16. We just saw... we just went over the feast days, and now we are on to a section that's going to have to do with justice and Israel's leaders. Now, before we get into this section, we need to understand something about it. The fact that it was just so revolutionary, the things that this section is going to lay out. Israel wasn't the only nation to have laws, obviously, right? And neither were they the only nation to hold justice as one of their core cultural values. But it is the dynamic between justice and law and their leadership in Israel that made it so different from all of the other nations. The power dynamic of ancient societies was generally like this. There are the powerful and there are the subservient. So powerful, subservient. Top dogs, bottom dogs. That sounds weird. But the powerful and the subservient. And power and status quo was usually maintained in three major ways. Number one was you would claim that you were related to or descended from divinity. In other words, you would claim that you were son of the gods, which is where the phrase "son of God" actually comes from. The emperor of Rome claimed that he was son of the gods. The Pharaoh claimed that he was son of the gods and that he was kind of like a god in transition. Like he began as a mortal and then when he died he would ascend to godhood or something like that. So this is one of the ways that the powerful, especially royalty, would maintain their power. They would convince everybody through like massive propaganda campaigns that they were related to, descended from the divine. It is how the Babylonian royalty maintained their place in the hierarchy, because, the legend of Gilgamesh being the ancient ancestor of the Babylonian royalty, and Gilgamesh was like 1/3 god or something like that. I forget the actual details. And that kind of brings up, how can somebody be 1/3 something? No, never mind. But the phrase "son of God" comes from that. It is a term for royalty. And so when the centurion who sees Jesus die on the cross says, "Surely this man was the Son of God," he is saying, surely this man was royalty because he's related to the divine. Because when he died, the sun was being darkened out and there were earthquakes and all of this, and he was saying all of these things and all of these things were happening around him. Then that's the kind of stuff from legend, from when ancient kings would die. The legends surrounding them would have this kind of stuff. So that is a term for royalty, son of the god. So when you are royalty in an ancient culture, one of the ways you would maintain power and status quo is claiming that you are related to or descended from divinity, and therefore everyone should listen to you. But also, number two was claiming that you were chosen by the divine. This went all the way up into the modern era, up until when monarchies were generally falling out of style, pretty much. And one of the most well-known ones of these is the legend of King Arthur. King Arthur became king because God chose him, and he showed that he chose him by having him pull the sword out of the stone. Right? That's the Arthurian legend, and it is God choosing someone to be king. And monarchs would do this all the time. The idea of the divine right of heaven or something along those lines, being divinely chosen to be the monarch or to be the ruler of a nation. That's how you maintain the status quo. But also, the third way is the most tried and true method of might makes right. So if you had the military strength, you had everyone under your thumb and you were the king. That's just how it worked. The Babylonians also did this kind of thing. Babylon is situated between two rivers, or at the intersection of two rivers. That's why it's called Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers. And the way that they held sway over the peasant population is the peasants who farmed and grew all the crops lived and worked between those two rivers on a massive system of irrigation canals, and the king's men controlled the waterways of those two rivers where the irrigation canals were fed. And so if the peasants rebelled, they cut off the water and everyone would die of thirst. So the peasants couldn't rebel, and that's how Babylon maintained its status quo. Might makes right. Same way when for Egypt, whoever controlled the Nile militarily also controlled trade, and therefore they could become the pharaoh. That's how they did it. Might makes right. In addition to claiming that you were related to the divine or that God chose you. But Israel had a completely different power dynamic. And it was built off of three things as well. Its power dynamic was built off the principles of, one, all humans are made in the image of God, not just royalty. Genesis chapter 1. God said, "Let us make man in our image." And all people after that were made in the image of God. Number two, while God did choose people, he also gave strict guidelines for their jurisdiction. They couldn't gain too much power. And we're going to see that as we read on. And also, number three, no one was mightier than God. And therefore, no human could be a law unto themselves, because God made the laws and he is the strongest. So might makes right still, but God is the mightiest. So our text begins in Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 18. You shall appoint judges and officers in all your towns that the Lord your God is giving you, according to your tribes, and they shall judge the people with justice, with just judgment. You shall not pervert justice. You shall not show partiality, and you shall not accept a bribe. For a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and subverts the cause of the righteous. Justice, and only justice, shall you follow, that you may live and inherit the land that the Lord your God is giving you. So justice and only justice you shall follow. That was the name of the game for the judges who were commissioned in Israel. They were commissioned to uphold justice. Forbidding bribery and holding judges accountable in the ancient world was generally unheard of. One, usually the judge would ultimately be the king, and so he was a law unto himself. But also forbidding bribery. Bribery was like the way that you got a judge to rule in your favor. It was accepted. An account of this in the New Testament is when Paul is in prison. The Roman governor, I believe it was Felix at the time, or maybe it was Festus. I believe it was Felix, kept him in jail for 2 years, though he had no real grounds to keep him in jail, because he expected a bribe from Paul, because that's just the way you did it. You bribed the judges. But in Israel, and as we see, really only in Israel, there's a couple other places that do this, but it was generally rare, they forbid bribery, and they held judges accountable. And then in verse 21 and onward, you shall not plant any tree as an Asherah beside the altar of the Lord your God that you shall make, and you shall not set up a pillar which the Lord your God hates. You shall not sacrifice to the Lord your God an ox or a sheep in which there is a blemish or any defect whatsoever. For that is an abomination to the Lord your God. If there is found among you within any of your towns the Lord your God is giving you, a man or a woman who does what is evil in the sight of the Lord your God, in transgressing his covenant, and has gone and served other gods, and worshipped them, or the sun and the moon, or any of the hosts of heaven, which is forbidden, and it is told you, and you hear it, then you shall inquire diligently. And if it is true and certain that such an abomination has been done in Israel, then you shall bring out to your gates that man or woman who has done this evil thing, and you shall stone him or her to death with stones. On evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses, the one who is to die shall be put to death. A person shall not be put to death on the evidence of 1 witness. The hand of the witness shall be first against him to put him to death, and afterward the hand of all the people. So you shall purge the evil from your midst. So there are forbidden forms of worship that God says. Israel's priests could not simply do as they please, like how in other places they did. Nor could any Israelite just sort of do as they please religiously. There were practices that were forbidden by the Lord, essentially any pagan practice was forbidden by the Lord. Planting an Asherah was forbidden. An Asherah was a fertility goddess of the Canaanites, and she was commonly depicted as a tree of life. That's also a place where the phrase tree of life is used aside from the Bible. So an Asherah, you can't plant an Asherah. You can't set up pillars, which would, of course, bear the carved images to worship. They were like idols. You could not offer imperfect animal offerings, those that had some sort of blemish on them. And also serving other gods, or serving any of the heavenly celestial bodies, the sun, moon, and stars. That was forbidden as well. It was punishable with death and was considered an exceptionally serious matter. So serious that the testimony of 1 witness was not sufficient. And think about that. You would think that if it was so serious, then even if it was just 1 witness, God would say, execute judgment. But it is serious in the way that it has to be made sure that it was true. And so it is so serious, 1 witness was simply insufficient. Multiple witnesses were needed to accuse. And obviously their stories had to line up. It had to be the truth. And a diligent investigation had to be made, because this is serious. This is not a method for your neighbor to get to kill off his neighbor. This is not a method for someone to just take revenge on their neighbor who has wronged them. It has to be seriously considered. A diligent investigation is made. And there has to be more than 1 witnesses, because it has to be the truth. It has to be real justice. It's not a witch hunt. It's actual justice. And that is huge. That's huge. And that is only seen in Israel. Then we get on to verses 8 through 13. If any case arises requiring decision between 1 kind of homicide and another, what are the other kinds of homicide? Anyway, 1 kind of legal right or another, or 1 kind of assault and another, any case within your town that is too difficult for you, then you shall arise and go to the place that the Lord your God will choose. And you shall come to the Levitical priests and to the judge who is in office in those days, and you shall consult with them, and they shall declare to you the decision. Then you shall do according to what they declare to you from the place that the Lord will choose. And you shall be careful to do according to all that they direct you, according to the instructions that they give you, and according to the decision which they pronounce to you. You shall do it. You shall not turn aside from the verdict that they declare to you, either to the right hand or to the left. The man who acts presumptuously by not obeying the priest who stands to minister there before the Lord your God, or the judge, that man will die. So you shall purge the evil from Israel, and all the people shall hear and fear, and not act presumptuously again. So there's the concept of bringing decisions before priests and judges. And if a matter could not be settled locally, you brought it to the priest, you brought it to wherever the judges was to whatever judge was in office at that time. And since they were to follow God's justice strictly, then their decision was to be respected utterly, because they are the arbiters of God's justice. They were to follow justice so strictly. Justice and only justice. So what they said was to be considered the decision of God because it's his justice. It was punishable with death for someone to ignore the ruling that was given. Remember, the great folly of mankind is, of course, that we always want to do what we want to do instead of what God wants us to do. Proverbs 21:2, everyone is an expert on self-justification. What we need to do, however, is to adhere to what is truly just. To ignore justice and do what we think is right is sin. It's how we got into our problems in the first place, and therefore we are not to do something like that. And finally, in chapter 17, verses 14 through 20, when you come to the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and you possess it and dwell in it, and then you say, I will set a king over me like all the nations around me. You may indeed set a king over you, whom the Lord your God will choose. One from among your own brothers you shall choose to set as a king over you. You may not put a foreigner over you who is not your brother. Only he must not acquire many horses for himself, or cause the people to return to Egypt in order to acquire many horses, since the Lord has said to you, you shall never return that way again. He shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turns away, nor shall he acquire for himself excessive silver and gold. But when he sits on his throne and his kingdom, he shall write for himself in a book a copy of this law, approved by the Levitical priests, and it shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God by keeping all the words of this law and these statutes and doing them, that his heart may not be lifted up above his brothers, and that he may not turn aside from the commandments either to the right hand or to the left, so that he may continue long in his kingdom, he and his children in Israel. So, firstly, it is implied Israel did not need to set a king over themselves straight away. This was a revolutionary concept. Israel had a king. It was God. And that was unheard of in the ancient world. But also, the king had to be a fellow Israelite and never a foreigner. Again, this was an unusual standard. If you look in world history, you will find that most of the time, the king and the governing body is a foreign power that was more powerful than the native population. That happened all the way up until the end of colonialism. And, we still have the ramifications of that today. But I'm thinking particularly of Egypt in the sort of 300s to 60s BC, when the Ptolemy kingdom ruled over Egypt. The Ptolemies were Greeks. Ptolemy was one of Alexander the Great's generals, his chief officers. And when Alexander died without an heir, he took the sort of southern portion of the Greek Empire for himself, and that included Egypt. And he made Alexandria the seat of his power. And so it was a pharaoh over Egypt who was not Egyptian, it was Greek. He was a Ptolemy. And that happened, that went on for pretty much until the Romans came in and took control of Egypt, which again is not an Egyptian ruling over Egypt. It's Romans ruling over Egypt. Cleopatra wasn't even Egyptian. I think she was like a little bit Egyptian, but she was mainly Roman, and she went by Roman standards of living as well, not Egyptian customs. So it is a very common thing in world history that foreigners ruled over less powerful vassal states or they just went in and declared themselves the king directly. And so the standard for Israel, that an Israelite, never a foreigner, was to be king over them, was extremely odd. Extremely odd. But the requirements for the king only get more unorthodox. The king could not acquire many horses, and he definitely couldn't get them from Egypt. Egypt was like known for their horses, for their chariots. The king, unable to acquire horses for himself, that, your horses, your horsemen, your chariots, that was your military power. The king was not allowed to build up a military strength like that. That's extremely unorthodox. And also, the king cannot marry many wives, and this would include concubines. Sorry, Saul, but it included all of your 700 concubines, not to mention your 300 wives. Come on. But the king was not allowed to marry many wives, and he couldn't have all of these concubines. He had to, if he did, his heart would be drawn away from God by all of his wives. And the most important thing to God seems to be that the king's heart stays close to God, therefore he leads the kingdom arighly. And also, consider this. A king had many wives because, one, they're, a way of making political alliances, yeah, sure. But also, it was a way of ensuring that your dynasty continued, because many wives means many children means statistically many sons, and many sons means many heirs. So no matter how bad things would get, most likely you would always have an heir to carry on after you, and therefore your dynasty would continue. God says, don't do that. Essentially, trust me instead. Don't marry many wives and have many concubines, because they will draw your heart away from me. But also, this is like one of the biggest ones that is the most unorthodox. The king cannot amass excessive amounts of wealth, excessive amounts of silver and gold. I mean, isn't that what a king does? Isn't that just what he does? He goes and he conquers and he trades and he amasses for himself massive amounts of wealth so that he remains the king, right? God says, no, you don't do that. Israel's king cannot do that. And also, what does God say Israel's king must do? One, he must write a legitimate copy of the law, of the Torah, and he must carry it around with him and read it every day of his life. The king of Israel was supposed to be a huge Bible nerd, and he must observe all of God's commandments. He is not an exception to the rules. And this, again, was extremely unheard of in the ancient world. Like I said, the king was a law unto himself, but in Israel, no one was above the law of God. And so now we come to chapter 18. We're going to skip over the provisions for the priests and Levites and the abominable practices in verses 9 through... oh, wait, no, we aren't. I'm in chapter 20. What am I doing? There we go. We're going to skip over the abominable practices from verses 9 through 14, and we're going to get to this final section of chapter 18. The new prophet like Moses. The Lord your God, verse 15, will raise up for you a prophet like me. This is Moses speaking, from among you, from your brothers. It is to him you shall listen. Just as you desired of the Lord your God at Horeb on the day of the assembly, when you said to me, let me not hear again the voice of the Lord your God, or see this great fire any more, lest I die. And the Lord said to me, they are right in what they have spoken. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brothers, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. And whoever will not listen to my words that he shall speak in my name, I myself will require it of him. But the prophet who speaks, or who presumes to speak a word in my name that I have not commanded him to speak, or who speaks in the name of other gods, that same prophet shall die. And if you say in your heart, How may we know the word that the Lord has not spoken? When a prophet speaks in the name of the Lord, if the word does not come to pass or come true, that is a word that the Lord has not spoken. The prophet who has spoken it presumptuously, you will need not be afraid of him. So, if a prophet comes and he's saying God says this, but it doesn't come to pass, it's not true, you need not be afraid of him. That is not a word that the Lord has spoken. But what I want to focus on right now is this concept, the new prophet like Moses. This prophet like Moses would receive his message from the Lord and deliver it to the people. So directly so that God would put his words in this prophet's mouth, just like he did with Moses. So much so that the message will carry all the authority of God himself. And if someone ignores it, God says, I myself will require it, that is his words, from him. Now keep all of that in mind, and let's look at who this prophet like Moses is. Who fits the criteria? It's not Joshua. It's not actually even Elijah or Elisha. Those are like the big prophets, right? But instead, when we get to John chapter 5, we see with Jesus, John chapter 5, verse 19, Jesus said to them, Truly I say to you, the Son can do nothing of his own accord, but only what he sees the Father doing. For whatever the Father does, that the Son does likewise. For the Father loves the Son, and shows him all that he himself is doing. And greater works than these he will show him, so that you may marvel. For as the Father raises the dead and gives them life, so also the Son gives life to whom he will. The Father judges no one, but has given all judgment to the Son, that all may honor the Son just as they honor the Father. Whoever does not honor the Son does not honor the Father who sent him. Truly I say to you, whoever hears my words and believes him who sent me has eternal life. He does not come into judgment, but he has passed from death to life. So Jesus points out, I can do nothing of my own accord. I'm doing exactly what God showed me that I should do, what the Father showed me that I should do. The Father judges no one. He gave all the judgment to me, the Son. And therefore, whoever honors me honors the Father, but whoever does not honor me does not honor the Father. Remember what I said, God will speak to this prophet so directly that his message is God's message, and it carries all the authority of God. And listening to it will be paramount to listening to, or tantamount to listening to God himself. Verses 30 through 32. I can do nothing of my own. As I hear, I judge, and my judgment is just, because I seek not my own will, but the will of him who sent me. If I alone bear witness about myself, my testimony is not true. But there is another who bears witness about me, and I know that the testimony that he bears about me is true. So Jesus says, I can do nothing of my own will, but as I hear, I judge. He's receiving the message from God, and he is judging according to that message. That's a significant detail. It especially relates back to that prophet like Moses. Verse 44 to the end of the chapter. How can you believe when you receive glory from one another, and do not seek the glory that comes from the only God? Do not think that I will accuse you to the Father. There is one who accuses you already, Moses, on whom you have set your hope. If you believed Moses, then you would believe me, because he wrote about me. He wrote of me. But if you do not believe his writing, how will you believe my words? Jesus just flat out says, Moses wrote about me. And so their minds obviously are supposed to go back and think, where in the world did Moses write about a prophet to come? The prophet like Moses. Jesus is the prophet like Moses. And in chapter 12, Jesus lays it out even more plainly. He says in verse 44, and Jesus cried out and said, whoever believes in me believes not in me, but him who sent me. That's okay. Yeah. And whoever sees me sees him who sent me. I have come into the world as light, so that whoever believes in me may not remain in darkness. If anyone hears my words and does not keep them, I do not judge him, for I did not come to the world to judge the world, but to save the world. Then he says in verse 48, this is the big one, right? This is the big hitter. The one who rejects me and does not receive my words has a judge. The word that I have spoken will judge him on the last day. For I have not spoken of my own authority, but the Father who sent me has himself given me a commandment, what to say and what to speak. And I know that his commandment is eternal life. What I say, therefore, I say as the Father has told me. Jesus says, if you do not listen, you do not receive my words, it is not me who is judging you, it is my words who is judging you. Jesus is intentionally saying things to make them think not of just any prophecy, but of that prophecy. The prophecy of the prophet who would be like Moses, coming to Israel to deliver to them a message directly from God that they need to listen to. And if they don't listen to it, God will require it, that message, his words, from them. It's huge. This is a big thing. Jesus was the prophet like Moses. That goes to show you how important, how integral Jesus was to his plan, and what the proper response from Israel was supposed to be. They were supposed to actually listen to Jesus, and the fact of the matter is, many of them did not. And the question now is, are we going to listen to Jesus? He's that prophet that was like Moses, that was to come and deliver God's words to the people. Are we going to listen to him? Or are we going to ignore him? Thank you for joining me this evening. This has been our class in Deuteronomy. I hope it has been enlightening and encouraging. I hope that everyone stays safe, stays healthy. I hope to see you next week. God bless you all, and have a good night.